How would you define the American grand strategy now, at this point in history? That is, during the Cold War, the grand strategy with, one rival, one other center of power with one competing ideology. It was, the grand strategy of containment and all the other components. It set a clear goal, which kind of brought more or less the whole political class together. All other strategies were kind of had to be subordinated to this wider grand strategy. What is it today? Well, how is the United States dealing with the massive changes in the world and its own role in this world? That's a large question for, yeah, but
Well, I think when uh, me and my friends, or my friends and I, thought about grand strategy over the decades, we always used to argue that obviously the Western Hemisphere is the most important area of the world for the United States. But given that the United States is a regional hegemon, there's no serious threats in the Western Hemisphere. The question is, what are the areas outside of the United States that matter the most from a strategic point of view? Where are our vital interests at play around the world? And I think most people in my circle agreed that the three areas that mattered the most were Europe, East Asia, because there were great powers in Europe and East Asia, and the Persian Gulf, because oil was there. Those were the three key areas of the world outside of the Western Hemisphere. And during the Cold War, we focused mainly on Europe because the Soviet threat was centered in Europe. But the Soviet Union was, and Russia is, physically located in East Asia, as we both know. So we cared about containing the Soviets not just in Europe, but in East Asia as well. Uh, and the Persian Gulf was the area where we had to do the least amount of work. The British did the heavy lifting in the Gulf up until 1968. And then after 1968, up to 1979, we depended on the Iranians. This is under the Shah, the Saudis, and we didn't have any great threat. After 1979, when the Soviets invaded Afghanistan and there was the revolution in Iran, and Iran was no longer an ally, we built the Rapid Deployment Force, which was an over-the-horizon capability. In other words, we were not physically located with military forces, or we didn't have many military forces physically located in the Gulf. We had this Rapid Deployment Force, which again was over the horizon. So you see that during the Cold War, we cared about Europe, we cared about East Asia, and we cared about the Gulf. Uh, then comes the multipolar world that we're now in. And China is the principal threat to the United States, and therefore we pivoted to Asia. And there was a lot of talk about pivoting away from Europe and minimizing our commitment to the Gulf because we didn't see any great problem in the Gulf. We thought we had things under control. Uh, and with regard to the Western Hemisphere, you know, things were pretty good in the Western Hemisphere. No serious threats to the United States. Along comes the Trump administration, back into the White House, January 2025. What you see is that President Trump decides to make the Western Hemisphere a high priority, and we're deeply involved in social engineering and military engagement in the Western Hemisphere. If you look at what's happening in Venezuela, if you look at what's happening with regard to Cuba, if you look at President Trump's rhetoric about the Panama Canal, about Greenland, and making Canada the 51st state, the United States is paying a lot of attention to the Western Hemisphere, which kind of befuddles me because I don't think we face any serious threats at this point in time in the Western Hemisphere. But nevertheless, we are deeply involved in doing social engineering and even maybe acquiring territory in the Western Hemisphere. You want to remember that President Trump said at the time when we captured President Maduro of Venezuela that the United States now, or he now runs Venezuela. And that he basically viewed Venezuelan oil as American oil. It's really quite remarkable. So you can see that we're on the march in certain ways in the Western Hemisphere. With regard to the Gulf, we're now involved in a major conflict with Iran. It's really quite amazing. One can make the argument, Glenn, that we will eventually leave the Gulf, that we can no longer maintain military bases there. Our alliance structure is in tatters. That may happen. But for the time being, if you look at American grand strategy, we are up to our eyeballs in alligators in the Persian Gulf. Uh, and as I said, we're deeply involved in the Western Hemisphere. With regard to Ukraine and Europe, as we talked about earlier in the show, it appears that President Trump is more or less re-engaging in Ukraine, getting more deeply involved. And one could argue, Glenn, as the tide turns against Ukraine, which you and I know is happening as we speak, that the Russians will feel, excuse me, the Americans will feel compelled to move in and do everything possible to rescue Ukraine so as not to suffer a humiliating defeat. And then there's East Asia. That is what the Pentagon calls the pacing threat. So we're not leaving East Asia. And if you look at what the Chinese are likely to do over time and what the Americans are likely to do over time, that's a dangerous area of the world. I wouldn't be surprised if 10 years from now, or even 5 years from now, when you and I are talking about all the problems in the world, that China is not at the top of the list. So all of this is to say that the United States, under President Trump, has a remarkably ambitious grand strategy. Think about what I said about the Western Hemisphere. Think about where we are in the Gulf. Think about where we are vis-a-vis Ukraine, and think about the pacing threat, China. We don't seem to believe in the word prioritizing. The United States still labors under the illusion that it can be everywhere and do everything all the time. And I think that's where American grand strategy is at the moment. I think we could have a long conversation, and we should do this the next time we talk, or maybe do it the next time we talk, about where American grand strategy is headed. Once these various conflicts are behind us or they sort themselves out. And here we're talking about Ukraine and Iran, and also to some extent places like Cuba and Greenland. Then we can maybe get a clearer picture of American grand strategy. But I do think, Glenn, we, the United States, are going to have to learn to prioritize. I think this idea that, we can maintain this militarized state that's involved in really deep-seated ways in all four of these regions is not workable over the long term.
No, that's what I thought was the main challenge to the United States at this time in history, though, that is, as transition from unipolarity, where essentially has a final say in every corner of the world, to multipolarity. The grand strategy would have to include priorities. That is, you can't be everywhere, then what comes first? And this, I don't want to belittle the politicians. I think this is a difficult thing to adjust to once you had a political culture over decades of being everywhere at the same time and embracing an ideology which makes it almost treasonous and uncaring not to be everywhere, because all our wars is of course sold as being about helping the disenfranchised and advancing liberal democracy. So it's very difficult to make this shift. But I thought that was the lesson from the Iran war, though. That is, if you can't have, when all the weapons had been spent in Ukraine, and then suddenly, how are we going to fight the Iranians? Then have to take the weapons from the Europeans, from the Ukrainians, from the East Asians, and send it all, not just to the Middle East, but Israel, because even the Gulf states were robbed of some of their air defenses. So I thought this was the main lesson. If you prioritize everything, you're not prioritizing anything at all. And but again, it could be, huge shifts in the international distribution of power. It's usually destabilizing because politicians, they do need time to adjust to new realities, I think. Anyways, do you have any final thoughts before we end the video?
Yeah, let me make two quick points. One is the debt problem. Uh,
I
and
sorry to interrupt, but I always look at the debtclock.org and I'm not even American. It's still depressing to me. It's a horrific number. So yeah, sorry. Go on.
no, no, you're right. It's you sort of think the chickens are going to come home to roost on that problem at some point in time. Second thing is, Glenn, if you look at the Ukraine war, and you think about fighting a war against China, or you think about fighting a war anywhere, what's very clear is that you need a large industrial base and you need the capability to produce huge numbers of weapons. Uh, I mean, again, just to go back to the Iran war, we had to quit after 40 days because we were basically running out of weaponry. It's truly amazing the extent to which we have run down our inventories of like Tomahawk missiles, Patriot missiles, THAAD missiles, uh, air to ground smart bombs, and so forth and so on. Really quite amazing. And it's also quite amazing how long it's going to take us to rebuild those inventories, which have been whittled down. Um, and what this tells you is that we are going to have to prioritize. If you're going to plan for a war in Asia, right, and you're thinking about how you deal with the Chinese in a war over Taiwan or the South China Sea, a war that's going to go on for many months. Now, let's hope this never happens. I'm not saying this is likely or it's going to happen, but the Americans are going to have to prepare for a long war. This is what the Ukraine war has taught us. And we don't have the manufacturing base. When you look at how long it's going to take us to replenish our depleted stocks from the Iran war, it's really genuinely frightening from a security point of view. Really, it's quite amazing. So I think when you look at the debt problem and you look at the weakness of the American manufacturing base and the need to build uh, a large scale inventory of weapons and to have the ability to produce weapons once the conflict starts, we have a lot of work cut out for us. And that's going to involve prioritizing. So I think that the events that are now taking place, let me put it slightly differently. The events that have taken place since the Ukraine war started in 2022 up to the present day, this 5 year period is a period in which we have, or maybe it's a 4 year period, is a period in which we have learned a lot. And what we have learned should leave us deeply worried about our future.